The honourable member for Rosevears.
Thanks, Mr. President. The bill before us started off as an additional simple amendment to allow individuals and parents of children who wish to live as a gender different to their sex of birth the option of having either the correct gender or no reference to their gender on their birth certificate without the need for invasive surgery, and to allow more time for parents who had doubts about the sex of their newborn child to register the birth and choose whether or not to have the reference to it on the birth certificate. So simple, and seemingly without controversy. To my mind, the amendment would help those with gender uncertainty as they grow up to avoid some of the pain of that uncertainty. I'm adamantly dedicated to that aim. Unfortunately, these amendments have attracted the ire of people in our community, and a long controversial argument has entailed. As always, on controversial issues, I've looked carefully at the arguments and I take pains to evaluate their validity. I have to stress, Mr. President, that a lot of arguments against this bill, to my mind, are furphies, red herrings at the very least.
That go for those supporting as well, red herrings there?
When you mumble, I can't hear a thing you're saying. And you did that all through the member for Murchison trying to speak, and she's right, it is very disrespectful. If you've got something to say, speak up so we can hear what the hell you're saying. Your turn.
I thought it made it clear.
Go on. What did you say?
I didn't say what I said, didn't I?
Speak up.
Well, look, this is not a game where we.
Well, this is what the member for Murchison, Mr. President, is turning it into, with this mumbling that goes on. You've spoken to him about it, but he keeps going on with interjections.
I think you meant the member for Windermere.
Oh, yeah, him as well.
So, if we'll keep our eye on the ball and just continue on.
Thanks very much. But it's disrespectful and it's off-putting when you're trying to present your arguments. At this stage, I want to refer to the full-page advertisement funded by the Catholic Church on Tuesday. Most of you will have seen that. It's claimed that this bill would compromise the integrity of people's identity, have serious implications for children's and women's safety, and make it difficult to get a passport. So I can't for the life of me, Mr. President, see the implications for children's and women's safety. Do those who funded and framed this advertisement think Tasmanians are not in touch with reality? I just want to read a letter that you all received. Others, I'm sorry if I've gazumped you by reading this into Hansard ahead of you, and I'm not going to... Like, we've received so much information and there are so many useful quotes that I could read in that I'm not going to labour the point. But I want to read this one in response to that advertisement. I apologise for including you in one email. I'm alarmed that a group called the Tasmanian Coalition for Kids has been formed to lobby the Upper House on amendments to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act that would make gender optional on birth certificates in Tasmania. I am writing to you to urge you to support the bill. I note too that the Catholic Archdiocese of Hobart has contributed to a newspaper advertisement placed in the media this week that supports the lobby group mentioned above. While the Archdiocese has a right to its point of view on religious grounds, I find it curious that in a statement it does not mention an objection in that sphere, but on the grounds of what it perceives as public concern. My concern is for anyone who is transgender, and not for the perceived reasons expressed by the Church and groups acting against the well-being of transgender people. Not that it should make a difference, but I'm a Catholic and I'm also concerned that, rightly or wrongly, the message being sent to parents with transgender children in Catholic schools is that their child is somehow inferior, somehow wrong, and somehow a freak. A child who is not given the right to be who they are, as is every other child, must be unbearable. I can only imagine how those parents and children feel. They need community support, not condemnation. Respectfully, Jeff Kevin. And I did phone Jeff and asked that if I could use his name and put that on Hansard, and he agreed. I spoke of red herrings earlier, Mr. President, and I believe that some of them need to be addressed. To be charitable, you could term some of them as misconceptions or ignorance, because, like me, people have not had to embrace the issue before. Most people have not had to think about our transgender community. It's been asserted that birth certificates are an historical document and are needed for genealogy. Mr. President, birth certificates are not an historical document. They are an identity document. Historical records are preserved by the registrar and will continue to be preserved under the amendments as described in section 28K1. Genealogical and historical needs are met by the notification of birth and registration of birth forms rather than by birth certificates. Another red herring, Mr. President. Doctors and medical professionals won't be able to do their jobs. Medical practitioners do not use birth certificates in any way. Any sex-specific risk factors are determined in conversation with the individual and through medical histories. Another criticism, Mr. President, is that the terms sex and gender are used interchangeably and inconsistently in the bill. Well, Mr. President, sex and gender are distinct terms used carefully and specifically. The definition of gender created in the amendments, which includes the apparent sex of an infant at birth, ensures that most individuals who do not eventuate to be transgender, gender diverse or intersex, and will therefore have no reason to complete a gender affirmation declaration, will be unaffected. This definition also ensures that historical birth sex data will be available to meet statistical and date linkage requirements if needed. So I could continue, Mr. President, but I assure you that you and other members, and you know, you are sick of the red herrings. I remain firmly supportive of the principles of this bill and what it's intended to achieve, and I want to detail some of the reasons for my position. Some opponents of this bill, Mr. President, argue that this House should be spending its time on what they say are more important issues, like the economy. I agree. But those same opponents have been mounting a campaign to make what are simple amendments into an issue which they feel could cause the sky to fall in. Also, I might point out at this stage that we don't run the agenda of the legislation here. I mean, we were getting the blame for this issue coming to the upper house. It's not of our making, it's come from downstairs. It might not be the normal process that we're used to, but we don't call the shots on what legislation we do unless it's a private member's bill. So this is not of our doing. This is of our work to try to fix up what's come before us. In my 17 years in this House, Mr. President, I've striven for justice, for human rights, and to minimise the potential hurt to individuals who feel that they are different from the overall society. And that, of course, includes issues like marriage equality. Well, this bill is right in there. It's right in there. But perhaps I should start this argument with the question: why should our society tell individuals how they should feel about their gender? Obviously, Mr. President, this bill will have a positive impact on transgender, intersex and gender diverse communities. Yes, they are perhaps a small minority. We've heard, I've heard 1 in 1,000 at one stage, but then it's blown out to 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000. It's a small minority. But their feelings and their interactions with the whole community are a concern that we must address. Apart from allowing parents whether or not to have a child's gender recorded by the registrar on a child's birth certificate, there is also provision to make amendment or to amend identification documents to reflect the person's lived gender without the need for gender reassignment surgery. I just want to digress a little bit, Mr. President, by mentioning the situation in Spain, a country which we sometimes perceive as very conservative in these matters. Well, Spain had marriage equality years before we did. The current situation is that sex recorded on birth certificates, it is recorded on birth certificates, but as soon as an individual is eligible for an identity document, they have the option of putting on it whatever they feel their gender is. Germany, since 2013, has allowed a blank space denoting gender on birth certificates for babies born with undefined sex characteristics. Since 2017, people have been allowed to register as intersex or identify as something other than male or female, or eliminate sex identification entirely. That's Germany. Mr. President, many of us until recently have been ignorant of the nuances concerning gender. But I want to quote now a few passages from a documentary by Katie Couric. I'm going to paraphrase, but Katie Couric is a journalist that I've long admired, probably for 30 years. She's worked on American television networks. She's in mainstream television, so she was curious about the transgender world and she went out to explore it around America. And she said during that documentary that so much has changed in a short period of time. It's being treated as a lot more complicated in a brave new world and will take some getting used to. Society gets happier, more creative. Some people will be more comfortable in their own skin, and this represents a move towards acceptance. External genitalia does not dictate your gender. It does correlate, but not for everyone. Views are changing. Parents make a lot of decisions in this binary world. However, young people should have the right to make their own decisions about their bodies. Transgender means denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity does not correspond with the gender assigned to them at birth. For transgender children, puberty is stressful, causes anxiety. They have to deal with puberty blockers, which is the pause button. This, of course, is a new area. The blockers are relatively safe and reversible and holds maturation for a couple of years for that long-term decision. Then comes the hormonal therapy of testosterone for female to male and estrogen for male to female. So Katie gave me some succinct observations in that documentary. An important part of this bill, Mr. President, is that it would amend the Anti-Discrimination Act 1998 to include a new definition of gender expression and to correct the former drafting area which leaves transgender Tasmanians without protection from incitement to hatred. And why the hell not? While we're looking at international issues, Mr. President, it's worth noting that by refusing to allow a married person to have a birth certificate consistent with their sex, unless they get a divorce, was breaching the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that Australia had been called on to revise its legislation to ensure compliance with that covenant. Australia too has been internationally criticised for a failure to uphold the human rights of LGBTI people and protect them against abuses such as violence and discriminatory laws and practices. So I want to quote, Mr. President, a principle agreed to at a meeting in Switzerland in 2017, and this resonated for me. Everyone has the right to legal recognition without reference to or requiring assignment or disclosure of sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Everyone has the right to obtain identity documents, including birth certificates, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Everyone has the right to change gendered information in such documents while gendered information is included in them. Mr. President, the idea that gender is not limited only to male and female is by no means new. Many cultures have long recognised third genders or other gender variances. This could include some interesting identities, and I know that most of you haven't heard these pronunciations, so I can proceed in the full knowledge that nobody will dispute what I say. Hijra, Metai, Layla, Skasana, Matsuali, Mithli, Kuchu, Kawain, Travesty, Muksay, Fafafine, Fakalati, Hamjinsgara, and Two-Spirit. And it's important to note the impact of colonialism on the prior social, medical and legal construction of gender and the consequent erasure of non-binary genders. Mr. President, we of course have had the experience of twinning with Samoa, which I visited 3 times, and they have a third sex recognised there and has an important place in their society. I'll just go to the work of Dr. Paul Vasey, who is an anthropologist who has studied the Fafafine, as they're called in Samoa. They've always existed in Samoa. These are feminine, same-sex attracted men. They're fully integrated into Samoan life, and they're clearly not binary. This also occurs in India, Mexico, and in classical Jewish text, there are 6 genders. These are socially unproblematic.
57 genders in America.
Yep, that's right. And it's a pathway down which we should go. These people are integrated into society. The family ends up benefiting and society ends up benefiting. So the Fafafine, Mr. President, in Samoa, they have a role to play within the family, and as I say, they are the third gender of Samoa. It's obvious, Mr. President, that intersex people who are born with physical sex characteristics that do not fit medical norms or female and male bodies are adversely impacted by the requirement that their birth certificate include gender. I believe that insisting on the inclusion of gender on birth certificates perpetuates the view that intersex children ought to conform with a gender determined by parents or medical practitioners. And this perpetuates the tendency towards the common practice of subjecting intersex children to unnecessary surgical and other procedures. It's patently obvious, Mr. President, that parents will still be able to have gender included on their child's birth certificate if they want, and most will. The Act currently requires a person seeking to apply to the registrar to change their sex to have undergone gender reassignment surgery and be unmarried. In order to make an application under Section 28A of the Act, an applicant must also provide, amongst other things, a statutory declaration from each of 2 medical practitioners verifying that the applicant has undergone gender reassignment surgery. Now that, Mr President, is absurd. I've spoken with a number of people who describe themselves as transgender or binary. And apart from suffering ignorant social attitudes, they cite access to birth certificates, passports and identification documents that reflect lived gender as barriers to employment, housing and access to services. Mr President, the requirement that transgender Tasmanians undergo gender reassignment surgery in order to apply to change their identification documents is an abusive requirement, as I've referred to earlier. Mr President, a few of us in the chamber have come across people who are not distinctly male or female as our society understands. But let's understand the other genders so we can make their lives easier. We've heard evidence about the number of suicides in the trans community. 50%. 50%. I'm not sure, attempted suicide or actually committed suicide. But that figure is just astounding. Imagine the mental torment and the torture that those people have gone through to get to a situation of contemplating suicide because of who they are. Intersex people are born with physical or biological sex characteristics such as sexual anatomy, reproductive organs, hormonal patterns and/or chromosomal patterns that are more diverse than socially understood concepts of male or female bodies. For some people, these physical traits are apparent prenatally or at birth, while for others, they emerge later in life. However, greater education is required as to the prevalence of intersex persons in our community and respecting their rights as both adults and children. They are part of our community and should be recognised, cared for and considered. That's why, Mr President, I support this bill wholeheartedly. I recognise the arguments of those who oppose it, but feel they are exhibiting cruelty to people in our Tasmanian community in contrast to what should be understanding and inclusion. You want to know the meaning of the word cruelty? Do you know the meaning of it? What are you interrupting now for? I was just finishing. Go on.
What you're saying, those who are exhibiting opposition to this are showing cruelty.
Yes, I'll read it again, just so you've got it nice and clear in your mind.
That's appalling.
Here we go.
Appalling.
Hey? Oh, yeah, try being born transgender and trying to exist your life as transgender, and the stuff that we've been going on with and that we've received, try to understand whether it's cruel or not. Well, I can tell you, you don't understand it. You don't understand it because you're but it is cruel.
Order.
It is
It's
cruel.
gone far enough.